Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my fall reading wrap-up. And I think fall is maybe the best reading time of year that I've had. Namely because a lot of new releases I've been sort of seeking out with looking forward to read this year, and then also a lot of nonfiction for Nonfiction November. So I actually wanted to start off with a really high note, and that is Just Us by Claudia Rankine. This is a work of nonfiction that has some mixed media and with essays, in which Rankine seems to deliberately place this work within the recent years of the United States having progressing racial injustice. And a few years ago, I read Rankine's Citizen, which at first I felt like I would have a lot of similarities between that and with Just Us. Namely, the intimidation factor of what I was expecting with Just Us, because Citizen, to me, was a lot more interpretive with how I could base my reactions on it. Because I feel like a lot of the symbolism or what was discussed in Citizen maybe went over my head, but I feel like Just Us approaches much more of a personal and intimate glance at Rankine's perspective with how well executed her essays are. As her essays are personal, but always on the basis of being self-aware for what I feel like the prime audience of this book being people that are aware of racial injustice, but could always expand and learn more. And for the lack of a better term, maybe for people who are woke, can just as easily stunt the progress of racial justice. And in the past few years of sort of this progressive trend of books coming out that are sort of starting places for learning more about racial injustice, Just Us seems to rhetorically have the notion that Rankine assumes that readers of all backgrounds have had some sort of encounter already with race that they should really sort of expand upon further, versus these books maybe assuming of only just now learning about how to be more proactive about racial justice. And with the use of mixed media in this book, how it helps cement this sense of time and place as well. So this was really effective for me, and I really loved this book. And not to say with my mention of those starting place books about race or anything that those are bad, but I think just how Rankine is sort of expanding upon what happens after reading those types of books. What more can we do to keep learning and keep trying to be better? And pivoting to fiction for a second, I also want to mention another highlight, which was What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. This book follows a woman as she has various encounters between friends, strangers, and even one of her exes. And she holds our hand as a reader in these experiences by sort of discussing these prolonged conversations that she has with these people, where after a while it does feel repetitive, but I think kind of enhances this feeling of also how it can feel kind of liberating to kind of just get to know people, and how eventually this book steers into something more specific of the narrator really latching onto the experiences that she's aware of with one of her friends having this illness. And with this framing, I think Nunez is just so good at knowing how to write about sentimentality. It still invites doom and melancholy in these pages and characters that also doesn't come off as bleak or desperately profound, which I think can sometimes be a hard line to balance. Between this book and Nunez's The Friend, which I also really loved, I think Nunez just really understands this perfect control over the tone of her books and how her characters help service the overall themes of what she's looking for. Maybe admittedly having these over symbolic gestures, but I think it feels vulnerable without being too overly emotional. It's a lot like reading a self-help book, but through the vehicle of fiction, which sounds like something I feel like would have been done already, but in a way, Nunez's work just is so refreshing to me, and I don't know why, but I really think Nunez could become a writer that I'd really like to investigate more of and read more of her backlist. And coincidentally, I read another book recently that left me wistful, but not in as good of a way. That was with Pure Color by Sheila Heti, which I got a galley of from NetGalley, and I think comes out in February of 2022. This short novel follows a woman named Mira, and Mira is constantly fixated on this idea of life being what she calls a first draft. And through that perspective, Mira develops these relationships that she finds to be very profound, whether ones that are ongoing, like with her father, or also with this woman named Annie. And over time, this causes Mira to think very philosophically about how her life has shape and meaning across the different perspectives of people that she's met. And that's when she starts talking about like being a leaf and stuff. So this book does require suspending your disbelief a little, which I think is always great to have in fiction. And I don't mind it in Pure Color, but I think a book sort of requires of me to feel at least a bit more acclimated into setting or character or voice before it starts to veer into that territory. Mainly it didn't stick for me just because of Heti's writing style with this stream of consciousness for some reason didn't land for me. And stream of consciousness isn't something I have an aversion to, but I just think on the basis of how it was a writing style for Mira herself, I just felt like there was somehow this conflict. I think just with Mira for her quest of a very meditative sort of line of thinking didn't feel entirely like I understood why it was coming from her and the need for it. But again, I really do love conceptually this idea of Mira's craving for this idea of a first draft of your life and what that really means. So I would think really this was a book more so about its execution for me versus anything else. So I'm definitely still interested in Sheila Heti, but I don't know, I feel like I could really tell maybe with reading another work by her maybe how I end up feeling about her. And speaking of firsts, like I was mentioning earlier with first drafts, I did read my first Akwaeke Emezi, and that was The Death of Vivek OG. As the title suggests, this follows Vivek OG up until Vivek's death. And surprisingly, I didn't really expect this story to sort of take on this mystery aspect, as we do sort of follow up to how Vivek died. But this isn't really a book about a clear resolution or anything with Vivek's death, but it's really about the lifestyle that Vivek had that is likely frowned upon, which is probably a huge understatement under the context and background of the setting of this book being in Nigeria, as Vivek explores sexuality and also the book overall exploring themes of gender and gender identity. It's really interesting and endearing to have read this book from the context of trying to feel known about a construction or like reading about someone trying to understand a construct of something like gender and sexuality. Not only from characters living in somewhere like Nigeria from my own Western perspective, but also how through characters that Emezi manages to sort of lay out this groundwork for the binaries of gender and sexuality and how the characters think about it, and really making characters conscious and accountable for their own considerations of what their thoughts do, not only for themselves and their own self-discovery, but on the basis of how that influences the people around them. Overall, though, I will say that Death of Vivek OG reminded me a lot in a sense of when I read Infinite Country by Patricia Engel earlier this year. Two books that I think did a great job in its execution, but I find don't really stay with me over time. But of course, there's nothing wrong with just appreciating a really good book, in my opinion. But I personally, for my own reading taste, look for something that does tend to stay with me or linger with me for quite a while. So I'm super excited for reading more Emezi in the future, especially with Freshwater. And the second to last fiction book I want to mention is Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri. And this book actually, I think, came out a few years ago, and it was originally written in Italian by Lahiri, but then she translated it herself into English, which is pretty cool. This book is pretty short, so it basically just follows this Italian woman as she's living her everyday life. And she makes these observations that feel very much like I'm reading a journal or a diary, instead of there really being any kind of story here. And unfortunately, I feel like that ultimately was what was lacking with this book for me. As I've noticed over time reading Lahiri, she does seem to be an offender of sort of losing my interest, unfortunately, as her stories often feel uninspired, which is weird because I feel like Lahiri writes with such consciousness of being a writer that loves storytelling so much. As with her novels, I feel like they've always lacked a sense of imagination beyond the general themes that they try to mainly focus on. And with Whereabouts, again, being another example, I feel like was more of a writing idea because this does tend to veer more into feeling like I'm reading more of a Ferrante novel maybe, or even a Rachel Cusk book, which is great because I love Cusk and Ferrante. I think Lahiri, it feels like she's trying to make this imitation of those writers, as this does feel different from her previous works. And I think that's mainly because I think Lahiri does so little with trying to place the reader in a sense of time and place, or really even have much of an association with the characters. In favor, I think, of trying to create more of this ambiance, which I don't think was quite there. And it's all just so bittersweet because I still love Jhumpa Lahiri as a writer because Interpreter of Maladies is probably my top favorite short story collection. I'm just really starting to wonder if Lahiri will ever spark that interest for me again, but I still have faith in her with whatever next writing project she does. But my final fiction book of the fall was way more successful, and I actually talked about it in my previous video, and that was Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. But basically I mentioned how I really liked this book because at times it sucked the life out of romance while Also, being a romance novel, this story follows a character named Martha as she describes a pivotal moment whenever she's 17 that a bomb went off in her head. Ever since then, Martha is kind of suspicious about trying to root relationships with other people. That becomes pretty apparent through the very wry and witty and cheeky tone that Martha has throughout the whole book. But the side characters of Sorrow and Bliss, I think, is where the book truly shines for me. Since this is one of the most well-accomplished books, I think, and all of the characters serving some sort of purpose through still focusing on our narrator being Martha. Sort of reflecting on Martha too, that she's so reliant on how she can perceive herself based on how other people judge her, which Mason choreographed so well with pitch perfect dialogue and delivery. And I think that's saying a lot because I mentioned this in my previous video too, but Sorrow and Bliss is a story where I'm still not quite sure what the actual story component was, beyond the general themes of mental health and general life malaise, but is surprisingly, in a good way, neither triumphal or neither too doom and gloom. I just really enjoyed the ride, and I really liked Martha's voice as a character, and that makes all the difference in reading a book sometimes. And now for the second half of this wrap-up, which is pretty much me bulldozing through a lot of the nonfiction I read for Nonfiction November. So up first, I wanted to mention Here For It by R. Eric Thomas. This is an essay collection where Thomas talks about anything between viral internet content, having a dumb crush while in college, and also eventually writing for Elle.com. And with all of this, I think it's to say that Thomas is really someone that knows how to write a good story, like a friend just telling you about something funny or pretty sitcom-y vibes about something that happened to them. My favorite example in this collection maybe being about a story about how a car crashed into his childhood home. And in these very clearly lighthearted approaches to essays like this, Thomas does squeeze in there pretty successfully these very deep, more reflective moments too, which at times can feel a little obligatory, but in other times really captivating, namely whenever Thomas, like you can tell, tries to take a longer time at fleshing out his essay. I think my favorite one being this really, maybe even the longest form of these essays being about Thomas in college having this crush on someone, and he does very embarrassing things that already gives me secondhand embarrassment thinking about, and how this experience, as he's writing it, does make him think about the pang of romance, especially being younger, but through the lens of Thomas also being a Black gay man. So overall, I really liked this collection. I would definitely put it in the feel-good category of maybe something you're looking for, maybe with your David Sedaris's and Samantha Irby's. Up next, I have The Crying Book by Heather Christle. This is another essay collection about how Christle curates this data of talking about the significance of crying. So going in, I was definitely expecting the formal evidence components of trying to talk about the cultural significance of crying, but I was hoping that this would be more of a Bluets by Maggie Nelson situation about taking a very clear subject matter and then also making sure to have those very self-reflective moments too. But I don't think that The Crying Book was quite there. Where Nelson, I felt like, knew how to be more conscious about a synthesis between authorial expression and creative writing, I felt like Christle was a bit more clinical about the subject of crying. But between all this research and evidence that she describes, she does get in there with just a little glimmer about some personal testimonials about her own life experiences with how she's thought of crying, but also then leads into a domino effect of thinking of some peripheral emotions about crying, like sadness and grief. And it's in those moments that the book really shined for me. I just wish it kind of held on tighter to those aspects, and I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more. Up next, I have Gentrifier by Anne Elizabeth Moore. This is a memoir where Moore recounts her time winning a house, and it's in Detroit in the early 2010s. In the context of time and place over a span of years, Moore also talks about how things like Trump's presidency also changed the landscape of her own environment in this new neighborhood. But kind of like The Crying Book, Moore also cites a lot of evidence regarding sort of the history of the housing crisis in Michigan and in Detroit. And weaved into these moments of thinking about the history of time and place, Moore also does a really great job, and you can really tell she just really appreciates the aspect of the storytelling of people. As the true treat of this memoir is anytime that Moore talks about the evolving community behind how it's sort of dawning on her that her neighborhood is really great, as her neighbors are predominantly people of color from low-income backgrounds. It's her relationship with her peers that really bleeds into Moore's concept of stability and capitalism kind of falling apart. I really liked this memoir, but I do feel like it was a bit one-note in its own way. While Moore on the surface, having gentrified this new neighborhood while coming in as a white woman, is certainly the focal point, and I think sort of what builds upon the persuasion of the marketing of this book. It seems like really the book sort of shines. It's like the best spotlight is given whenever her neighbors are able to come in and be interesting, even more interesting than Moore herself, I would think, or at least through Moore's sense of thinking about her past, living there, and just thinking fondly of her experiences, which I think she did a really good job at describing. Gentrifier was kindly sent to me by Catapult, which is a publisher I really love, and I believe it's out now, so you can grab a copy. And the second to last book I have for this wrap-up is A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. And I think what surprised me the most about this book is how literal it is with its source material, as this book is basically a written version of a class that Saunders taught in school, with this class being about Russian literature, and the book does have samples of Russian short stories that Saunders taught, and even as Saunders holds your hand through guiding you along the themes and meanings of the stories, what I really love about this book is just how Saunders prefaces a lot of these chapters with his very clear enthusiasm for fiction. And I've recognized already a few of these stories having read them before, and I do say I would have a very beginner level enthusiasm for Russian literature too. So that being said, I feel like if maybe you're not into Russian literature, or maybe if you haven't read some of these stories, as there were a few for me that I haven't read, in a way it did feel like I was doing work while reading this book, which I know isn't a feeling that a lot of people want to have whenever they read for pleasure. So I can definitely feel this is hit or miss for some people if they choose to grab this. But I think what I really love about this is not only how Saunders makes like reading fiction or fiction itself feel inspired, but also just how reading feels something to aspire toward, which I think is really great, and I think it really worked on me. And last but not least is one of the most enjoyable reads I've had this year, and that is Sounds Like Titanic by Jessica Chiccehitto Hindman. This is a memoir about how Hindman joined a fake orchestra that travels across the country in the early 2000s, which does in fact sound like she joined a cult. Whether it's her enigmatic boss that is rarely ever seen, and so it feels like he has his own lore, or in hindsight traveling across the country in a very dangerous, beat-up van. The whole reason that Hindman joins this orchestra is kind of by accident in its own way, as she joined from the sole purpose of need, as she needed money to continue living in NYC as she was a student at Columbia. And the whole tone of this book, I would say, is often comedic, so the very accidental nature of everything does feel really fitting. But it's whenever Hindman glances back about her past growing up in West Virginia, I think it's really what sort of rationalizes this sense of it feeling all accidental, really just being a need for survival. By recalling these memories of her childhood that really signify this sense of resilience, or at least I would say within the contrast of thinking of somewhere like growing up and living in West Virginia and then living in New York City. And it's these moments of thinking of her childhood that I think really shines with this book, mainly because we get some citations of Hindman's own beginning with encountering music and finding that she has proficiency with it. So it all does become even more bittersweet, with NYC being this beacon of where your dreams come true, only for Hindman to join a fake orchestra, even though she is talented at music. And it really weighs on her with this crushing reality that as she's literally playing like these performances where people are none the wiser in the audience, as like a recording of some sort of symphony plays in the background, Hindman does introduce this kind of surprising but welcomed thesis about how something as crazy as this maybe really was just the right place at the right time in history, being the early 2000s whenever this was all set. As Hindman mentions things like with 9/11 happening and maybe people really wanting to give into something like a universal experience with music, seeking comfort in an experience even though knowing it's not real. And it's moments like this too, whether something like that Hindman thinks about or also in her childhood. This book is a wild ride and I really liked it. So it is really entertaining, I think, and super bingeable too, I would say. Although, of course, I do think I have a bias having grown up in West Virginia, and Hindman talks a lot about growing up in Appalachia and West Virginia. And there's a specific moment too, whenever Hindman later talks about moving from West Virginia to Virginia with her family, and she describes the traveling there, and I know for a fact it's the exact same drive I do in between back and forth whenever visiting my family back in West Virginia too. So it's all a little surreal and quaint to have read, so I think that kind of gave me a soft spot for it too. And that does it for my fall reading wrap-up, so congrats if you made it this long. I hope everyone is having a restful and cozy end to the end of the year. And the next time I might see you might even be for my best reads of 2021. And I'm already making up some notes for that, and my list is surprisingly changing a lot. So I'm really curious myself what the final product will be. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.